The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Stirling Castle as Margaret Thompson adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and surveyed the magnificent garden spread before her. As head gardener for the past 15 years, she had transformed these historic grounds into something truly spectacular. The Queen's upcoming visit in just 3 weeks had everyone at the castle working overtime. But Margaret felt a deep sense of pride knowing her gardens would be the crown jewel of the royal tour. The gardens themselves were a masterpiece of careful planning and dedicated cultivation. Rows of pristine roses in every shade imaginable lined the main pathways, their petals still heavy with morning dew. Delicate lavender bushes created purple waves across the lower terraces, while carefully manicured hedges formed intricate patterns that could be fully appreciated only from the castle's upper windows. Margaret had spent months selecting each variety, ensuring that every bloom would be at its absolute peak during the Queen's visit. Behind her, the sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of James MacLeod, the castle's facilities manager. His usually calm demeanor seemed slightly frayed this morning as he approached with a clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. "Margaret, we need to discuss the final security arrangements for the royal visit," he began, his Scottish accent thicker than usual when he was stressed. "The protection officers want to know about every entrance and exit to the garden areas." Margaret nodded, understanding the gravity of hosting such an important guest. She had worked with royal visits before, but this one felt different. The Queen had specifically requested to see the historic gardens, having heard about Margaret's restoration work from several horticultural societies. The pressure to create something truly memorable was immense, but it was also incredibly exciting. They walked together along the main garden path, discussing security protocols and viewing angles. The castle's ancient walls rose majestically around them, creating a dramatic backdrop for the carefully cultivated beauty below. Margaret pointed out the various sections she had created. The medieval herb garden with its collection of plants that would have been grown here centuries ago, the modern rose garden with varieties from around the Commonwealth, and the wildflower meadow that attracted countless butterflies and bees. The timing couldn't be more perfect, Margaret explained as they paused beside a particularly stunning display of hybrid tea roses. "These beauties will be in full bloom, and the weather forecast looks ideal. I've even arranged for the fountain to be cleaned and the water features to be running at their best." She gestured toward the ornate stone fountain at the center of the main garden, where water danced in the morning light. James made notes on his clipboard as they continued their tour. The gardens covered nearly 3 acres within the castle grounds, each section carefully designed to complement the historic architecture while providing a living showcase of Scottish horticultural excellence. Margaret had incorporated traditional Scottish plants alongside carefully chosen international varieties, creating a garden that was both authentically local and globally representative. As they reached the far end of the gardens, near the ancient castle walls, Margaret stopped to deadhead a few spent blooms from a climbing rose that cascaded down the weathered stone. "You know, James, I sometimes think these walls have seen more history than we could ever imagine. Kings and queens have walked these paths for centuries, and now we have the privilege of adding our own chapter to that story." The morning routine continued as Margaret's small team of assistant gardeners arrived for their daily briefings. Sarah, a young horticulture graduate who had joined the team 6 months earlier, was particularly excited about the royal visit. Her enthusiasm was infectious as she described the research she had been doing into the historical significance of various plants in the collection. "Did you know," Sarah said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "that some of the herbs we're growing in the medieval section were actually used by Mary, Queen of Scots, when she lived here? I found records in the castle archives that mention specific plants grown for medicinal purposes in the 16th century. Margaret smiled at the young woman's dedication. It was this kind of attention to detail and genuine passion that made the gardens truly special. Every plant had been chosen not just for its beauty, but for its connection to the castle's rich history. The result was a living museum that told the story of Scotland through its flowers and plants. The team dispersed to their various tasks: watering, pruning, weeding, and the countless small adjustments that kept the gardens looking perfect. Margaret took one final walk through her domain, checking on the progress of a late-blooming variety of roses that she hoped would be ready in time for the visit. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. As she made her way back toward the castle's main buildings, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction with what she and her team had accomplished. The gardens were truly fit for a queen, and she was confident that the visit would be a tremendous success. Little did she know that a four-legged resident of the nearby countryside was about to present an unexpected challenge to all her careful planning. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills when Margaret noticed something unusual near the garden's perimeter fence. A section of the old stone wall that bordered the adjacent farmland appeared to have some loose stones. She made a mental note to have it checked and reinforced before the royal visit, not wanting any security concerns to mar the perfect day she had planned. Back in her office, a converted room in one of the castle's historic towers, Margaret reviewed her detailed timeline for the next 3 weeks. Every day was carefully planned, with specific tasks assigned to ensure that every aspect of the gardens would be perfect. She had backup plans for weather contingencies, alternative routes in case of problems, and even spare plans ready to replace any that might not perform as expected. The phone rang, interrupting her planning session. It was the local florist confirming the delivery of additional cut flowers that would be used to supplement the garden displays on the day of the visit. Every detail had been considered, every possible scenario planned for. Margaret felt confident that nothing could go wrong with such careful preparation. 3 days later, Margaret arrived at the gardens earlier than usual, eager to check on a new planting of delicate orchids that had been installed in the greenhouse. The morning was crisp and clear, with just enough moisture in the air to make the spider webs glisten like diamonds across the carefully maintained lawns. As she unlocked the main garden gate, she noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Hoofprints. Small, neat hoofprints pressed into the soft earth of her prized rose bed. Margaret knelt down to examine the prints more closely, her mind racing through possibilities. They were definitely equine, but too small for a full-sized horse. A pony, perhaps, or maybe a young foal. But how had any animal gotten into her secure gardens? She followed the trail of prints, which led from the rose bed toward the herb garden, then seemed to circle around the fountain before disappearing onto the gravel path. The more she investigated, the more puzzled she became. The perimeter fence was intact, the gates were locked, and there were no obvious signs of how an animal might have entered the gardens. Yet the evidence was unmistakable. Something with hooves had been wandering through her carefully cultivated paradise. As she continued her investigation, Margaret discovered more disturbing evidence. Several of her prize roses showed signs of having been nibbled, with stems cleanly bitten through and flower heads missing entirely. The damage wasn't extensive, but it was precisely the kind of setback she couldn't afford with the royal visit approaching so quickly. "This is a disaster," she muttered to herself, calculating how long it would take for the damaged plants to recover. Some of the affected roses were rare varieties that she had been nurturing for months specifically for the Queen's visit. The thought of explaining to the royal advance team that her gardens had been vandalized by an unknown animal made her feel slightly sick. When Sarah arrived an hour later, she found Margaret crouched beside the fountain, measuring the hoofprints with a ruler and making detailed notes in her garden journal. "What's happened?" Sarah asked, immediately sensing the tension in her supervisor's posture. "We've had an uninvited guest," Margaret replied grimly, showing Sarah the evidence. "Something with hooves has been treating our gardens like an all-night buffet. Look at this damage to the Duchess of Cornwall roses. Those took me 3 years to get established properly." Sarah examined the nibbled stems with growing concern. As someone who had grown up in the countryside, she recognized the neat, precise cuts that indicated the work of a small horse or pony. "This definitely looks like pony damage," she confirmed. "But I can't understand how one would have gotten in here. The fencing is secure, and there are no gaps large enough for even the smallest Shetland to squeeze through." The two women spent the morning conducting a thorough investigation of the entire garden perimeter. They checked every section of fencing, every gate latch, and every possible entry point. Everything appeared to be secure, yet the evidence of an equine intruder was undeniable. It was Sarah who finally solved the mystery. While examining the old stone wall that bordered the adjacent farmland, she noticed that several of the ancient stones had shifted, creating a gap just large enough for a determined small pony to squeeze through. "Look at this," she called to Margaret. "The mortar has crumbled away, and these stones have moved. There's your entrance." Margaret examined the gap with a mixture of relief at solving the puzzle and frustration at having another problem to deal with. The wall was part of the castle's historic structure, which meant that any repairs would need to be approved by the heritage authorities. Getting such approval and completing the work before the royal visit would be challenging, to say the least. "We need to call James immediately," Margaret decided. "He needs to know about this security breach, and we need to get emergency approval for repairs. In the meantime, we'll have to find a temporary solution to keep our midnight visitor from returning." James arrived within 30 minutes, bringing with him Donald Fraser, the local mason who handled most of the castle's stonework repairs. Donald examined the damaged wall section with the practiced eye of someone who had been working with old stone for over 40 years. This is a problem," Donald confirmed, running his hands along the crumbling mortar. "This wall is probably 300 years old, and the original lime mortar has finally given up. The stones have shifted with the frost and rain, creating this gap. It's remarkable that only a small animal has found it so far." The discussion that followed involved multiple phone calls to heritage officials, security coordinators, and the royal advance team. Everyone agreed that the wall needed immediate repair, both for security reasons and to prevent further garden damage. The challenge was completing the work quickly without compromising the historical integrity of the structure. While the adults debated procedures and permissions, Sarah had been quietly observing something interesting. "I think I might know whose pony has been visiting us," she said during a break in the conversation. "I was talking to Mrs. Campbell from the farm next door yesterday, and she mentioned that their new Shetland pony, Hamish, has been escaping from his paddock regularly. They've been finding him in different fields around the area." This revelation led to an immediate phone call to the Campbell farm. Mrs. Campbell, a cheerful woman in her 60s, confirmed that Hamish had indeed been proving to be quite the escape artist since arriving at the farm 2 weeks earlier. "Oh, that wee devil," she laughed when James explained the situation. "He's been keeping us on our toes with his wandering. We thought we'd secured his paddock properly, but he seems to find every weakness in our fencing. I'm so sorry about your gardens. We had no idea he'd found his way onto the castle grounds." The conversation revealed that Hamish was a rescue pony who had been rehomed to the Campbell farm after his previous owners could no longer care for him. He was still adjusting to his new surroundings and seemed to view every fence as a challenge to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. "He's actually quite a sweet little fellow," Mrs. Campbell explained. "Very friendly and gentle, just curious about everything. He seems particularly drawn to flowers and has been sampling every garden in the neighborhood. We've been working with a local horse trainer to help him settle down, but it's going to take some time." Margaret felt her frustration beginning to ebb as she listened to Mrs. Campbell's description of the wayward pony. Despite the damage to her gardens, she couldn't help but feel some sympathy for an animal that was simply exploring his new environment. Still, with the royal visit looming, she couldn't afford any more midnight raids on her carefully planned displays. The immediate solution involved Donald Fraser working through the night to temporarily seal the gap in the wall with quick-setting mortar. The permanent repair would have to wait for proper heritage approval, but the temporary fix would keep Hamish out of the gardens for the crucial weeks ahead. As evening approached and the wall repair was completed, Margaret stood in her gardens once again, surveying the damage and planning the recovery work. Most of the affected plants would recover in time, and she had backup specimens that could be transplanted if necessary. The crisis had been averted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last they heard from the adventurous Hamish. 2 weeks had passed since the wall repair, and Margaret had almost convinced herself that the pony problem was behind them. The damaged roses had recovered beautifully, with several producing even more spectacular blooms than before, as if the nibbling had somehow energized their growth. The royal visit was now just 1 week away, and everything was proceeding perfectly according to plan. The morning routine had become even more precise as the important day approached. Margaret arrived before dawn each day to check every aspect of the gardens, ensuring that each plant was at its absolute peak. The weather had been cooperating magnificently, with just enough rain to keep everything lush and green, followed by clear skies that brought out the vibrant colors of every flower. Sarah had thrown herself into the final preparations with tremendous enthusiasm, creating detailed maps of the garden tour route and researching interesting historical facts about each plant species they would be showcasing. Her excitement was contagious, and even the normally reserved James seemed to be enjoying the anticipation of the royal visit. It was during her early morning inspection on Tuesday that Margaret first noticed something amiss. A section of the lavender border showed signs of disturbance, with several plants looking slightly trampled. Her heart sank as she examined the damage more closely, recognizing the telltale signs of hoof prints in the soft earth between the plants. "Not again," she whispered, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She followed the trail of evidence, which led from the lavender border through the herb garden and toward the prize-winning rose display that was meant to be the centerpiece of the Queen's visit. The rose garden told a more serious story. This time, the damage was more extensive and more selective. Hamish had apparently developed quite sophisticated tastes during his absence, focusing his attention on the most expensive and rare varieties in the collection. The Jubilee roses, specially cultivated to commemorate royal occasions, have been particularly targeted, with several showing significant nibbling damage. Margaret's careful inspection revealed that the temporary wall repair was still intact, which meant that Hamish had found another way into the gardens. A more thorough search of the perimeter eventually revealed his new route. A section of hedgerow at the far end of the property where the thorny boundary had grown thin over the years, creating a gap just large enough for a determined Shetland pony to push through. When James arrived for their daily coordination meeting, he found Margaret sitting on a garden bench, staring forlornly at her damaged prize roses and making notes in her emergency contingency plan folder. The sight of Britain's most experienced royal gardener looking so dejected was almost as disturbing as the garden damage itself. "How bad is it this time?" James asked, though Margaret's expression had already given him a pretty good idea of the answer. "Worse," Margaret replied simply, showing him the extent of the damage. "He's gotten more adventurous with his menu, and he seems to have developed a particular fondness for the exact varieties that were meant to be the highlight of the tour. It's almost as if he knows which ones are most important." The assessment that followed was sobering. While most of the damaged plants would survive, several of the key display pieces would need to be replaced entirely. Margaret had backup plants in the greenhouse, but they weren't as mature or as perfectly conditioned as the originals had been. The timing was particularly cruel, coming so close to the royal visit that there was no opportunity for proper recovery. "We need to call Mrs. Campbell again," James decided. "This situation can't continue. With the security preparations intensifying, we can't have random animals wandering around the castle grounds." The conversation with Mrs. Campbell revealed both the source of the problem and the challenge of solving it. Hamish had indeed escaped again, this time by somehow learning to operate the gate latch on his paddock. He had been missing for 2 days before they discovered his new hiding place in a wooded area near the castle grounds. "He's become quite the little genius at escape artistry," Mrs. Campbell explained with a mixture of pride and exasperation. "The horse trainer says he's never seen such a clever pony. Hamish seems to study every fence and gate until he figures out how to get past it. We've reinforced his paddock 3 times now, but he just finds new ways out." The conversation took an interesting turn when Mrs. Campbell mentioned that Hamish seemed particularly drawn to the castle area, almost as if he was specifically seeking out the gardens. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "He could wander anywhere in the countryside, but he always heads straight for your direction. The trainer thinks he might be attracted by the smell of the fertilizers you use, or perhaps the variety of plants appeals to him." This insight led Margaret to a new understanding of the situation. Rather than being random acts of garden vandalism, Hamish's visits were deliberate expeditions to what he apparently considered the finest dining establishment in the area. From a pony's perspective, the royal gardens represented an irresistible smorgasbord of carefully cultivated delicacies. "We need a different approach," Margaret told James after the call ended. "Simply trying to keep him out isn't working. He's too smart and too determined. Maybe we need to think about this differently." The solution that emerged from their brainstorming session was both practical and creative. Instead of fighting Hamish's determination to visit the gardens, they would work with it. Margaret proposed creating a separate area within the castle grounds where Hamish could graze safely without threatening the main garden displays. "The old walled garden behind the stable block has been in use for years," Margaret suggested. "We could plan it with pony-friendly vegetation and create a legitimate grazing area for him. If we can satisfy his curiosity and his appetite in a controlled way, he might lose interest in the main gardens." James was initially skeptical about the idea of essentially inviting a trespassing pony to become a permanent resident of the castle grounds. But the more they discussed it, the more sense it made. The alternative was an ongoing battle of wits with an increasingly clever escape artist, with no guarantee that they could keep him out during the crucial week ahead. The plan that developed involved cooperation from multiple parties. Mrs. Campbell agreed to officially loan Hamish to the castle for the remainder of the summer, which would make his presence legal and his care official. The castle's insurance company was surprisingly amenable to the arrangement, especially when they learned that having a grazing animal on the grounds might actually reduce fire risk by keeping grass areas trimmed. Donald Fraser was called back to assess the old walled garden area and determine what work would be needed to make it suitable for a pony resident. His inspection revealed a space that was perfect for the purpose, safely enclosed with good drainage and plenty of room for both grazing and shelter. This could actually work very well, Donald observed as they walked through the overgrown area. The walls are in good condition, there's a natural water source from the old spring, and the soil looks rich enough to support good grass growth. With a bit of cleanup and some new gates, this could be an ideal pony paddock. The speed with which the plan came together was remarkable. Within 2 days, Donald had installed proper gates and water troughs. Margaret had arranged for emergency grass seeding in the bare patches, and James had completed all the necessary paperwork to make Hamish an official temporary resident of Stirling Castle. The most challenging part was actually catching Hamish and relocating him to his new home. He had been spotted several times wandering around the castle grounds, but always managed to disappear before anyone could get close enough to lead him away. It was Sarah who finally succeeded in capturing the elusive pony, using a bucket of apples and an enormous amount of patience. "He's actually quite friendly once you approach him correctly," Sarah reported after successfully leading Hamish to his new paddock. "He just doesn't like being cornered or rushed." I think he was enjoying the game of hide and seek as much as the garden raiding. Watching Hamish explore his new home was both entertaining and reassuring. He investigated every corner of the walled garden with obvious satisfaction, sampling the grass and examining the new water trough with the air of a restaurant critic approving of the accommodations. The morning of the Queen's visit dawned bright and clear, with just enough breeze to make the flowers dance gently in the sunlight. Margaret had been awake since 4 o'clock, conducting her final inspection of every garden bed, every pathway, and every carefully positioned display. After weeks of preparation and the unexpected challenges presented by Hamish, everything was finally perfect. The security team had arrived before sunrise, conducting their own thorough examination of the grounds and establishing checkpoints at strategic locations throughout the castle. Margaret watched with fascination as these professionals went about their work, noting details that she would never have considered important. Every bench was examined, every tree inspected, and every possible hiding place investigated with methodical precision. James moved through the preparations with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this day for months. His clipboard had grown thicker over the weeks, filled with contact numbers, backup plans, and detailed timelines that accounted for every minute of the royal visit. Despite the chaos of the final preparations, he maintained his characteristic calm demeanor that helped keep everyone else focused and confident. Sarah had transformed into an expert tour guide overnight, memorizing not only the botanical details of every plant in the collection, but also fascinating historical facts about the castle and its previous royal residents. Her enthusiasm for the project had grown throughout the preparation period, and she was clearly thrilled to have the opportunity to share her knowledge with such a distinguished visitor. The first indication that something might be amiss came at 8 o'clock, just 2 hours before the Queen's scheduled arrival. One of the security officers approached James with a concerned expression and a radio crackling with urgent communications. "Sir, we have a situation in the walled garden area," the officer reported. "There appears to be an animal loose in the secure zone, a small horse or pony. Our perimeter team spotted it during their final sweep." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Hamish was supposed to be safely contained in his new paddock, but she had learned not to underestimate his escape capabilities. The timing couldn't have been worse, with security teams already on high alert and the royal arrival imminent. A quick investigation confirmed their fears. Hamish had somehow managed to work loose one of the gate latches in his new home and was once again wandering the castle grounds. This time, however, his exploration had taken him into areas that were now considered high-security zones, setting off alarms and causing considerable concern among the protection officers. "We need to locate and contain that animal immediately," the senior security officer declared. "We cannot have any uncontrolled variables in the area during the royal visit. If necessary, we'll have to postpone until the situation is resolved." The thought of having to postpone the Queen's visit because of a wayward pony was almost too much for Margaret to bear. Months of preparation, weeks of careful cultivation, and countless hours of dedicated work could all be wasted because of one small Shetland's wanderlust. "Give us 30 minutes, Margaret pleaded. "We know this pony, and we know how to handle him. Sarah managed to catch him before, and she can do it again. Please don't cancel the visit because of this." The next 20 minutes were among the most stressful of Margaret's life. Teams of staff and security personnel spread out across the castle grounds, searching for any sign of Hamish. Radio communications crackled constantly as search teams reported their progress, and coordination efforts intensified. It was Sarah who finally spotted him grazing contentedly in a small meadow area behind the main garden displays. He had apparently worked his way through the entire garden tour route, sampling flowers as he went, before settling down for a peaceful breakfast in an area that offered an excellent view of the approaching driveway. "He's right in the path of the royal motorcade," Sarah reported via radio. "If the Queen arrives on schedule, she's going to get quite a surprise when she sees a pony standing in what's supposed to be a perfectly manicured lawn area." The capture operation that followed was complicated by the need to maintain absolute quiet and avoid any disruption to the final preparations taking place nearby. Sarah approached Hamish slowly and calmly, using techniques she had learned during her countryside upbringing. The pony seemed to recognize her from their previous encounter and allowed himself to be approached without alarm. "Come on, Hamish," Sarah whispered, producing another bucket of apples from seemingly nowhere. "You've had your adventure. Now it's time to let the Queen have hers." The walk back to the walled garden took longer than expected, as Hamish seemed determined to investigate every interesting smell and sound along the way. Security personnel followed at a discreet distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing Sarah to handle the situation with her proven expertise. With just 40 minutes remaining before the royal arrival, Hamish was finally secured in his paddock with a significantly reinforced gate system. Donald Fraser had worked frantically to install additional latches, and safety mechanisms that would hopefully prove more challenging for the clever pony to defeat. "That should hold him," Donald declared, wiping sweat from his forehead as he completed the final adjustments. "I've added 3 separate locking mechanisms, and even if he figures out how to operate one of them, the others should keep him contained." The final preparations proceeded at breakneck speed. Margaret and her team conducted one last inspection of the garden tour route, removing any evidence of Hamish's morning adventure and ensuring that every display was positioned perfectly. The flowers seemed to glow with health and vitality in the morning sunlight, creating exactly the impression that Margaret had envisioned months earlier. James coordinated the final security checks and confirmed that all personnel were in position for the royal arrival. The advance team had approved every aspect of the visit itinerary, from the welcome ceremony to the garden tour to the final farewell. Everything was ready for what promised to be a memorable and successful event. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, Margaret positioned herself at the garden entrance, wearing her best dress and feeling a mixture of pride, excitement, and nervous anticipation. Behind her, the gardens stretched out in all their glory, representing months of careful planning and dedicated work by her entire team. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the royal motorcade, and Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken with excitement. This was the moment she had been working toward for so long, the culmination of her efforts to create something truly worthy of a queen. The first car in a motorcade slowed as it passed the meadow area where Hamish had been grazing earlier. Margaret held her breath, hoping that all traces of the pony's presence had been successfully eliminated. To her relief, the vehicles continued smoothly toward the main castle entrance without any indication that anything was amiss. As the Queen's car came into view, Margaret straightened her shoulders and prepared to welcome the most important visitor her gardens had ever received. Despite all the challenges and unexpected complications, this moment made everything worthwhile. The royal visit was about to begin, and Margaret's gardens were ready to shine. The Queen emerged from her vehicle with the grace and dignity that had made her beloved throughout the Commonwealth for decades. She was smaller in person than Margaret had expected, but her presence seemed to fill the entire courtyard as she was welcomed by the castle's officials and introduced to the key staff members who would be guiding her tour. Margaret's moment came when James stepped forward to introduce her as the head gardener responsible for the magnificent displays they were about to see. "Your Majesty, this is Margaret Thompson, who has transformed these historic gardens into what many consider to be among the finest royal garden displays in Scotland." "How wonderful to meet you, Margaret," the Queen said warmly, extending her hand with a smile that immediately put Margaret at ease. "I've been looking forward to seeing your work ever since I heard about the restoration project. The photographs I've seen suggest that you've accomplished something quite remarkable here." The garden tour began at the main entrance, where Margaret had positioned her most spectacular display of hybrid tea roses. The Queen moved through the gardens with obvious appreciation, asking knowledgeable questions about plant varieties, growing conditions, and the historical significance of various sections. Her genuine interest in the botanical aspects of the tour was both surprising and delightful to Margaret, who had prepared for a much more formal and distant interaction. "These climbing roses are particularly magnificent," the Queen observed as they paused beside the ancient castle walls where Margaret's prize specimens cascaded down the weathered stone. "The way you've trained them to complement the architecture rather than compete with it shows remarkable sensitivity to the historical setting." Sarah walked slightly behind the main group, ready to provide additional information when requested, and clearly thrilled to be participating in such a momentous occasion. Her preparation proved invaluable as the Queen asked increasingly detailed questions about the historical context of various plant choices and their connection to Scotland's horticultural heritage. The tour proceeded flawlessly through the herb garden, where the Queen showed particular interest in the medieval medicinal plants that had been cultivated according to historical records from the castle's archives. Margaret felt her confidence growing as she realized that her visitor was not only polite, but genuinely engaged with the work they had accomplished. As they approached the central fountain area, which represented the culmination of Margaret's design vision, the Queen paused to admire the way the water features had been integrated with the surrounding plantings. "The sound of the water adds such a peaceful quality to the space," she remarked. "It must be lovely to work in such beautiful surroundings." It was at that moment that Margaret heard a sound that made her blood run cold. From somewhere behind them came the distinctive clip-clop of hooves on stone, growing steadily louder as it approached their location. She turned slowly, hardly daring to look, and saw exactly what she had feared. Hamish had escaped once again and was trotting purposefully toward the royal party. The security officers reacted immediately, moving to position themselves between the Queen and the approaching pony, their hands reaching for communication devices and protective equipment. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone tried to assess whether this represented a genuine security threat or merely an embarrassing disruption. "Oh my," the Queen said calmly, looking past the security officers to observe Hamish's approach. "It appears we have an additional member of the welcoming committee." Hamish seemed completely oblivious to the alarm he was causing. He trotted directly toward the Queen with the confident air of someone who belonged exactly where he was. His small stature and obviously friendly demeanor made him appear more comical than threatening. But the security implications were still serious. "I'm so terribly sorry, Your Majesty," Margaret began, her face flushing with embarrassment. "This is Hamish, a local pony who has been challenging our security arrangements. He seems to have developed an unusual interest in the gardens." What happened next surprised everyone present. Instead of backing away or allowing her security team to intervene, the Queen stepped forward slightly and extended her hand toward Hamish. "Hello there, little fellow," she said gently. "Are you the castle's official garden inspector?" Hamish approached the Queen with obvious delight, allowing her to stroke his nose and seeming to pose for the photographers who were discreetly capturing every moment of the encounter. His behavior was perfect, as if he understood the importance of the occasion and wanted to make the best possible impression. "He's quite charming," the Queen observed, continuing to pet Hamish while the security team maintained a watchful but less tense posture. "I understand he's been sampling your roses, Margaret. What's his verdict on the quality?" The absurdity of the situation seemed to strike everyone simultaneously. Here was the Queen of England, in the middle of a formal garden tour, having a casual conversation about a pony's dining preferences while said pony stood contentedly beside her, accepting royal attention. "He seems to prefer the more expensive varieties, Your Majesty," Margaret replied, finding her sense of humor despite the stress of the situation. "His taste in roses is unfortunately quite sophisticated." "Excellent judgment," the Queen laughed. "Though perhaps we should discuss his timing. I imagine his garden visits haven't always been convenient for your maintenance schedule." Sarah stepped forward with remarkable composure, producing a handful of proper pony treats from her jacket pocket. "Your Majesty, if I may offer Hamish something more appropriate than your prize roses," she suggested, showing the treats to both the Queen and the pony. "What a sensible idea," the Queen approved. "Prevention is always better than cure, isn't it, Hamish?" The next few minutes were unlike anything any of them had experienced during a royal visit. The Queen continued to interact with Hamish while Margaret explained the challenges they had faced with his garden raids and the creative solution they had developed by creating a special paddock for him within the castle grounds. "So he's become an official resident?" the Queen asked with obvious amusement. "How wonderful. Every garden should have a character like Hamish to keep things interesting." The photographers were having the time of their lives, capturing images of the Queen with her unexpected new friend. The photos would later become some of the most popular and widely circulated images from any royal visit, showing a relaxed and genuinely delighted monarch enjoying an unscripted moment with a mischievous Shetland pony. "I think Hamish has earned his place here," the Queen declared as Sarah led the pony away with promises of more appropriate refreshments. "Anyone with such determination to appreciate beautiful gardens clearly has excellent taste." The remainder of the tour proceeded without further incident, though the mood had become considerably more relaxed and informal following the Hamish encounter. The Queen continued to ask detailed questions about the garden restoration work and expressed particular appreciation for the way historical accuracy had been balanced with contemporary horticultural excellence. As the visit drew to a close, the Queen took a moment to speak privately with Margaret beside the rose garden that had started the entire Hamish saga. "You've created something truly special here, Margaret," she said warmly. "The gardens are magnificent, but what I'll remember most is the way your team handled that unexpected situation with such grace and humor. That says a great deal about the quality of people you have working with you." The formal farewell took place in front of the castle's main entrance, with the Queen thanking everyone involved in making the visit so memorable. As her car pulled away, Margaret caught a glimpse of the Queen waving from the window, and she could swear she saw her looking back toward the gardens where Hamish could be seen grazing contentedly in his paddock. "Well," James said as they watched the royal motorcade disappear down the drive, "that's not exactly how we planned it, but I think it went rather well." Margaret looked around at her beautiful gardens, where her team was already beginning to clean up from the visit and return everything to its normal routine. Despite all the stress and unexpected complications, she realized that Hamish had actually made the day more special, not less. The Queen's obvious delight in meeting him had transformed a formal garden tour into a genuinely personal and memorable experience. Later that evening, as Margaret made her final rounds through the gardens, she stopped by Hamish's paddock to check on their unexpected star. He looked up from his grazing with what she could swear was a satisfied expression, as if he knew exactly what he had accomplished that day. "You knew what you were doing, didn't you?" Margaret said softly, offering him a carrot from her jacket pocket. "You turned our perfect formal visit into something much better, a real moment of joy." As she walked back toward the castle, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with perfectly maintained flower beds or flawless execution of planned events. Sometimes the best moments were the unplanned ones, and today had reminded her why she loved working with living things, whether they were prize-winning roses or mischievous ponies who knew how to steal the show.